From the founding fathers to Silicon Valley, the U.S. has had a long tradition of borrowing the best ideas from around the globe. Then came Trump and his more insular approach, which tilted the global balance of power. But with Biden in office, the U.S. could return to the tradition by looking abroad for best practices. In a Bloomberg Opinion article this weekend, editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite wrote, quote, "For all the talk about American exceptionalism, the best American leaders have never been ashamed of learning from abroad, especially in times of trouble. The founding fathers carefully studied the world's most successful political systems, particularly those of Britain, France, and ancient Rome." Here to discuss is Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite. He's also the co-author, along with Adrian Wooldridge, of The Wake-Up Call, Why the Pandemic Has Exposed Weakness of the West and How to Fix It. John, thanks so much for coming on Quick Take today. You had a piece out over the weekend that urged Biden to look abroad as he plans his administration. So where should he be looking?
I think that there are two sets of places to look. One is East Asia. And basically what happened, and this will be, I think people who watch Quick Take would understand this, is that basically what happened in business was that Asia came up with a whole series of new smart ways to make cars, 20, 30 years ago, where you had Honda and Toyota, and American industry fought back by copying those ideas. But what's been happening at the same time is that places like Singapore have come up with a way of making leaner, smarter government, and America pretty much has ignored that. And by contrast, what's happened is other bits of Asia have begun to copy it. And if you look at COVID, the difference in the numbers between the number of fatalities in America per million people, now over 800, sadly. All the countries, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, they're around for 2030, if that, per million people. So they have managed to work this much better. And what worries me is it's not just to do with COVID. If you look at the rankings of schools or education or any of those sort of things, or healthcare generally, these are the countries that are doing really well. And America used to be really good at seeing what worked elsewhere and borrowing it. And this time, that doesn't seem to have happened.
So it's so interesting because you argue that it would be a mistake to blame the Trump administration for this idea of America first and America not looking abroad. In fact, you write, Washington sadly has stopped learning from abroad in terms of ideas and has become the rich world's most parochial capital city. What happened? When did we stop looking and trying to learn lessons from abroad?
I think pretty much it was sort of a generation ago. The last time that the American public sector, it's quite interesting, was sort of widely admired, where sort of 75% of Americans trusted their government, was back in the 1960s. And America does have this history of, as I said, reaching out and borrowing. But it certainly goes back, the fact that the government is falling behind goes back way before Trump. Don't get me wrong. Trump did a lot of things that did not help America with COVID. But fundamentally, if you have a public health system that's set up to look after the old and the rich rather than the poor, a pandemic was always bound to expose that. I talked about education. American schools have been going down for ages. You might argue Trump has done nothing to improve them, but he didn't start that. As for things like racist policing, I used to live in Los Angeles when Rodney King happened. And that was 30 years ago, rather sadly for my age. But all the same, you can't blame all these things on Trump. Trump didn't help mend them, but he's far more a symptom of the fact that America has not been sort of dealing with its public sector, dealing with its government, than a cause.
So as an American, I found myself rather depressed reading this piece because it talks about the ways that the U.S. has fallen behind. I guess my question to you, John, would be, do you think Americans should be optimistic, given the track record of the past generation's politicians, that we can see some meaningful change over the next 4 years?
Well, I always think Americans should be optimistic because that's what's best about it. And you look at the private sector in America, as I talked about what the American private sector did in terms of cars. Remember how years ago, how Detroit looked completely left behind by Japan. It fought back. Now you have Tesla, which is an American company. On the public sector, again, America used to copy things. It doesn't. But the basic thing is, if you look, we have a virus resilience tracker on Bloomberg. America does terribly on that. It's 17th in the world. The interesting thing is it would be far lower. It would be in the mid-30s in terms of dealing with this disease. But for one thing is vaccines. And you look at vaccines, that's where the private sector comes in. And so there really is a really big gulf between the public sector and the private sector. And what I think COVID showed is that you have to get your public sector right. Otherwise, it becomes the difference between living and dying. You cannot have a system where Americans were dying at 30 times the rate that was happening in China, which is the main strategic adversary, let alone these other, much smarter democracies I've been talking about.
Yeah, it's just absolutely staggering to see the difference when it comes to those pieces of data that you highlight in your piece. You do write that the president-elect actually is in an unusually good position when it comes to break the patterns of past presidents and what we've seen over the previous generation. Why is President-elect Biden the man for the job?
Well, I think he's in a good position. There's a lot of good things and a couple of bad ones. The good things is, this is a man who does understand the broad, Joe Biden has been put on the Senate Foreign Relations thing for 30 years. He's also a moderate Democrat, which is not actually a bad place to begin, because the reason why American government has sort of fallen to the level it is really on the Republican side. You've got people who their only answer to everything to do with government is to make it ever smaller, to make it so small you could drown it in a bathtub, to use one Republican phrase. On the other side, Democrats have been useless because of the ties to the public sector unions. If American schools, you look at the PISA rankings, which are the international OECD ones, America is, I think, 15th in reading, 20th in math, and 30th, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but miles behind all the East Asian countries I've been talking about. Well, the biggest problem in American schools, most people would say, is the teachers' unions, and they're far too close. So Joe Biden, he is moderate. He has the advantage that he can tell people, I've looked around the world and we are being left behind. And I think the thing you can really call on this, and I think Trump may have done him at least one favor in this, is you can say, this is a struggle with another country. There is a competition going on with China. And what has happened with COVID very plainly is that China worked better on that. You look at the school rankings, they're technically top. They're probably cheating a little bit about how they say that, but by any measure, their 15-year-olds in the big cities at least are doing much better than American 15-year-olds. So, there is a reason to fight back. And the reason why that matters is if you look at the history of government reform, countries tend to go into it when they think they're in real competition with other people. So Joe Biden can say, look, okay, I know we have a lot of support in the public sector unions, but we can't do that much we need to change that in order to compete with the outside world. And Joe Biden, I've seen that world. And it's, the differences are now becoming really large. I've talked about education and healthcare. You can look at smart cities. You can look at all these things. And the American public sector is being left behind. So Biden can say to Democrats, we're the party of the public sector. We have to make this better. But that does mean accepting the thing that you have to get rid of bad teachers.
Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite, thanks so much for your time and joining us on Quick Take today. We appreciate it.
The biggest stories the moment they happen from around the globe. Subscribe to Bloomberg Quick Take now for insight in an instant.